I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to have been in Venezuela while Chavez was campaigning. And I'll never forget, 2 3 hour long speeches, and essentially would make all sorts of promises. He was going to end corruption forever. He was going to make certain that the rich got what they deserved, that they have been stepping on the backs of the poor for too long, and he was going to, take it from them and give it to the poor, and all the poor would have good homes and enough food, and the government would take care of them. It was, in short, a very rosy picture of you will never have to worry about anything ever again because the government is going to handle it for you. Those were, just a summary of the promises. Hours and hours of speaking and promises and painting this picture. And it was crazy to me when I was there because nobody in Venezuela was suffering that much. Yes, there was poverty. There's no question. My own family definitely was in the lower class in Venezuela, but you had enough food to eat. You had a roof over your head. You had water and electricity, and we had the lowest, gasoline prices in the world. You could go to the local pharmacy and get any drug you needed. The hospitals have always been, what you could afford, but there's always been Catholic hospitals that treated the poor no matter what. It's really strange the way Chavez would be making these promises, and I would be listening with my own relatives, and I'll be saying, but we don't really have, we don't have that problem right now. We're not starving. We have food. But that's the sense of what he would say to get elected.
Well, let's put it in context and kind of walk back a little bit in the history of Venezuela. And the first part is really the oil boom from the 40s to the 70s. So, Patricia, do you want to cover that?
Sure. I'll be happy to, yes. Geologists from the Royal Dutch Shell struck oil in the northeast region of Venezuela in 1922. Annual production during the 1920s increased from about 1 million barrels to 137 million, putting Venezuela second only to the U.S. in total oil output. By the mid-1930s, oil totaled 90% of exports and was pushing out all other economic sectors. However, foreign companies, including Royal Dutch Shell, controlled 98% of Venezuelan oil. In response, the Venezuelan government enacted a law in 1943 that required foreign companies to give half of their oil profits to the state. Within 5 years, the government's income had increased sixfold. Venezuela's prominence in the oil market and government oversight of the industry was a constant throughout the 1940s and 1950s. In 1960, Venezuela became a founding member of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, otherwise known as OPEC, through which the world's largest oil producers coordinate prices to give states more control. Joining OPEC substantially benefited Venezuela during the 1970s, when an OPEC embargo during the Yom Kippur War caused oil prices to soar. Venezuela's per capita income quickly became the highest of any country in Latin America as oil revenues quadrupled in 1976. President Perez created the state-run oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, the abbreviations are PDVSA, to supervise the oil industry.
So the oil bust. So in between 1980s and the 2000s, in the 80s, global oil prices plummeted due to crude oil surpluses after the 1970s energy crisis. As Venezuela was almost entirely reliant on oil, the price crash brought Venezuela's economy down with it. In 1989, President Perez implemented an austerity package as part of an international monetary fund bailout. Riots and strikes ensued, followed by an attempted coup by Hugo Chavez in the early 90s. Although unsuccessful in his initial overthrow attempt, Chavez rose to fame and was elected president in 98. And once in power, Chavez raised oil income taxes on foreign companies in Venezuela. He promised to use the revenues to expand government-run welfare programs, hire more government workers, raise the minimum wage, and redistribute land. Meanwhile, the state-run oil industry faltered due to the control structure of the government. After a strike in 2002-2003, Chavez fired thousands of PDVSA workers, replaced them with loyal supporters with little technical or managerial expertise, and foreign investor and oil firms disliked the government interference, lost faith in PDVSA, and stopped operations. So do you want to read about the collapse here, starting in 2000?
Absolutely. In an attempt to gain more control over the economy, President Chavez went on a nationalization spree in the 2000s that pushed out all private enterprise, starved industries of technical expertise and investment, and sent government-controlled institutions into a downward spiral. Exchange rate controls and price controls broke the basic link between supply and demand, creating surreal, sorry about that, creating surreal economic distortions. For more information on supply and demand markets and price controls, there's a policy brief called Free Enterprise Brief. This suffocated private enterprise. Price controls prevented private businesses from setting their own prices, making it nearly impossible to make a profit. Both foreign and domestically owned companies stopped investing in Venezuela, and new businesses did not replace them due to red tape, corruption, and fear. Their private property was not secure. In 2011, Latin America received over $150 billion in foreign investment. Venezuela only accounted for $5 billion of this amount, while neighboring Brazil received $67 billion. Chavez garnered strong relationship with countries such as China, Russia, and Cuba to endure the inevitable disasters of his policies. He frequently announced new government programs to deliver free or heavily discounted goods that resulted from these relationships, such as refrigerators and cars, to the poorest in the nation. These efforts kept the worst-case scenario of Venezuela's impending crisis at bay and also continuously won Chavez's popular sentiment around election times. This stopped when Chavez died, reportedly of cancer, in 2013. Chavez's vice president, Nicolas Maduro, assumed the presidency in 2014, but this did not change the economy's trajectory. Oil prices tumbled, inflation reached over 50%, prompting Maduro to cut public spending. By mid-2016, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans were protesting. Maduro's response was to crack down on dissent. For more on Venezuelan history, Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, you can watch The Collapse of Venezuela.